Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Todd Miller and Ryan Ripley. Based in Indiana, Ryan is a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org and has experience as a software developer, manager, director, and Scrum master at various Fortune 500 companies in the medical device, wholesale, and financial services industries. Based in Maryland, Todd is a seasoned Agile enthusiast with a mission to drive organizational excellence in today's dynamic business landscape, dedicated to coaching and training enterprises and teams all over the world. You can follow them on Twitter at Todd_Miller11 and at Ryan Ripley, and check out their excellent videos on YouTube at Agile for Humans. Ryan and Todd are the authors of the book Fixing Your Scrum: Practical Solutions to Common Scrum Problems. In the book, they show you how to avoid and reverse broken Scrum practices that limit your organization's ability to take full advantage of the agility Scrum should bring. In this interview, we're going to talk about their backgrounds and careers and their book, and we're going to talk a little bit about their experience as authors and their particular experience with this book. So thank you very much, Ryan and Todd, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, this is fun. Thanks for doing it.
Thanks. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin stories. So I was wondering if, Ryan, you wouldn't mind going first and talk a little bit about your background and your career.
Yeah, my career was a roller coaster many, many years ago. So I've been in this racket for probably the last 25 years. I started as a software developer and worked my way through. I was around during the .com bust. So I was in Austin, Texas, bouncing around startup to startup and developing in different languages and different areas. Came back to the Midwest, in a medical device company, spent 12 years there learning how to be a project manager, a manager, a director. Went into retail, then financial, and then bounced around startups. And so just to really tried to work hard at whatever I was doing, pick up new skills along the way, finished a few degrees throughout that journey. And then, back in 2010, took a class in Seattle with Ken Schwaber on Scrum and really just fell in love with working that way. It just made sense. The idea of a project manager trying through force of will and a PowerPoint slide deck, trying to make something happen just always felt off to me. And Ken really presented such a better way to do it. And so after that, became addicted to Scrum, started really working in that way, brought it to the companies I was working with, and just really tried to work that way, whether we were allowed to or not. Eventually, when became more connected to Scrum.org, I went through the trainer process, started teaching solo, and then at a face-to-face, Todd and I met up during a flight delay. So Todd was flying back to Pennsylvania, I was flying back to Indiana. We got delayed, spend way too much time in a bar up at Logan Airport, and then decided to write Fixing Your Scrum together, decided to teach classes together. We made a lot of very fast decisions, but it all worked out, and we've been doing this ever since.
Yeah, that's great. And Todd, what about you?
Actually, fairly similar story. Started as a software developer for many years, and then suddenly found myself doing product owner type stuff and needing something a little bit more. I was doing some XP stuff, extreme programming stuff. Read Ken Schwaber, Mike Beale's book, Project Management, Agile Project Management with Scrum is the name of the book. And just started using Scrum ever since. So Ryan's point, whether we were allowed to or not. At that time, it was not so much allowed to, you just did it because you needed a better way to work than just a traditional project management. Then similar kind of stuff. I joined consulting agencies with Scrum Masters for various projects. I've been a product owner for various projects. Got in contact with Scrum.org, attended a beta teach of the Nexus class for Scrum.org, where I met Ken Schwaber and Patricia Kong, and Rich Hunhausen, give him a shout out too. And never really looked back, became a trainer. I've been a trainer now for 8 years, which time has really flown by. But yeah, that's it for me. Short summary.
Thanks very much for that. Just to go into one or two details, Ryan, so you worked for a medical device company for, I think you said 12 years.
Yeah.
What was that like? I mean, for people interested, what was that like? I mean, there's so much at stake in the creation of medical devices and things like that. Was I mean, I imagine there was a lot of regulation involved as well. Was the way you developed the products regulated?
Yeah, so it absolutely, it impacted every aspect of our work, right? So when you're working in medical device and we're working in implants, so hips and knees, shoulders, elbows, extremities, it's class 2, class 3, class 4 medical devices. And so whenever you're putting a product into the human body, the regulations and rules are very, very strict. And so we were under FDA regulation. It is a publicly traded company. So Sarbanes-Oxley, all of those rules come into play. So depending on which system you're touching and what you're developing, I mean, you could have 4 or 5 different government agencies involved in monitoring and overseeing how you work. And ironically, Scrum was a great fit there. You would think an agile practice would suffer in such an environment. And in fact, we were able to use the framework to not only see where the delays were happening, but to also make things repeatable, make things reliable, and also convince, clinical, compliance, legal that some things needed to be checked, thoroughly, other things didn't. But yeah, it definitely impacted, almost every area of our work, software to product. I mean, even the packaging on a medical device has to be perfect, and the labeling has to be consistent with what's expected, not even just in the US, but by country. So you ship something to the European Union, the packaging has to be different than what's in the US. And if you ship it to a particular country, there could be additional rules and regulations. So keeping track of all that, the definition of done in Scrum, for example, certainly helped with that. Here's all the things that have to be true for a product to be ready for this step of validation or this step of passing regulation. And so, yeah, it adds an immense amount of complexity to product development. But fortunately, Scrum is a great framework for coping with, a complex situation.
Yeah, I know that's really great. We'll get into the details of what some of those loaded terms mean, like framework and complexity and things like that, which is really great. But I really like the idea that like the added, normally people are, the added complexity of, having 4 government regulators or something like that and things like that. How is any kind of framework going to work with that? And it's like, well, one that's based on empiricism and the facts on the ground. Yep. And that's iterating and learning as it goes. And Todd, I was just wondering about, so you started out as a software developer, I believe you said, and then you found yourself kind of in the role of product owner. Do you remember when that first happened?
Yeah, working on a project that I was the only person developing, and it got quite popular, and I found myself surrounded by a bunch of other developers working on it. And at first, I'm going to admit, one of the things we talk about in our book, Fixing Your Scrum, is I was a Scrum Master and a product owner at the same time, and it wasn't working all that well. There's a lot of tension on the team until one of the developers said, you're not supposed to do that according to the Scrum guide. And I was like, maybe I should get some training on this. So I actually went through some training and came back and I was like, you're right. You want to be a Scrum Master? And then got into the product ownership aspect of it, where, to your point, empiricism, that's when I really learned about complexity, because I remember just really falling in love with ideas and then talking to customers and them reaffirming my love for the idea and then implementing it and no one using it. And that happening to me several times, where I'd be so charged up, I'd get the team all charged up, I'd get the customers charged up, and then no one would use it. And I'm like, this is just, and I drove myself crazy because I was trying to find causality in that. It's like, but everybody was saying that they would use this. Everybody was saying they loved it. We're so excited about it. And then no one would use it. And that's where I really started to think, well, let's find even faster ways to ship these things, right? Let's not build out this whole idea over 3 sprints or 4 sprints. Let's find a quick way to get an idea out there and validate all the things that people were saying, including my customers who were telling me things that they absolutely need and then wouldn't use. That was when I just remember like an aha moment, because I'm just trying to tie all the strings together to try to figure out where things went wrong. And I just remember being like, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to tie these strings together. I think I just need to let go sometimes of the fact that we're going to be wrong with producing things that people like, and then you're going to produce things where you're like, I think this is okay, and all of a sudden it's huge. It's wild. So I learned it from that angle first, which was good lessons to carry into the times when I was a Scrum Master and working with product owners.
Yeah, it's very interesting that it's sort of in the context of sort of having a kind of defined framework with a guide and stuff like that. The idea that part of it actually is like kind of a little bit of letting go around the kind of rules and definitions and things like that you encounter. Since this is a sort of general interest podcast, because people can write books about anything, maybe the best thing to do next would be for us to talk a little bit about the history of Scrum, and that way sort of embed an explanation of what Scrum is into why we're here. Talking about it now. So Ryan, why don't you have a go at it and talk a little bit about the history of Scrum?
Yeah. So Scrum is, the first paper written on the concept of Scrum was back in 1986, right? So there's probably a ton of listeners right now who weren't even alive yet. But in 1986, these two gentlemen, Takeuchi and Nonaka, wrote a paper called The New Product Development Game in Harvard Business Review. And it was the catalyst for Ken and Jeff coming together a number of years later in the mid 1990s to start formulating this idea of what Scrum as a framework could look like. I think the Uppsala conference, was it, Todd? Was it 2000?
It was 1996, actually.
It was 90. It might have been 96. I think you're right. They released the first look at Scrum. And it's significantly different today. Of course, it evolved and changed, but the base elements remain the same. We call it a framework because it's incomplete. It's the scaffolding of what would be needed for empirical product control in a product development environment. And what I mean is it identifies 5 events, right? The sprint, this container, this limited amount of time that we're going to use to try to build an increment of product. And then sprint planning, a daily Scrum, sprint review, and sprint retro. And these events are opportunities to inspect and adapt the way we're working, the way that we're building product, what we're going to build, how we're doing in the marketplace. We're taking these intentional moments to pause and reflect at appropriate times about the different aspects of product development. And so this framework has those events. There are the 3 accountabilities: the Scrum Master, the product owner, and developers. So the Scrum Master is watching the process, removing impediments, trying to keep people as effective and as possible. The product owner is primarily accountable for value, right? Let's make sure that what we're doing is the most valuable thing possible. It's that we're releasing at the right time, the right place for the right people. And of course, the developers are the ones building the product. And so these 3 accountabilities use the events to build product in an effective way. Then 3 artifacts that round out the framework: the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment. The product backlog is this ordered list of things that we could choose to do as we pursue our product goal. The sprint backlog are the things we chose to do in this current sprint as we pursue a sprint goal. And then the increment is what we actually built. Completely integrated and merged and combined with all past work. And so what's really interesting about all that is that those 3, the events, the accountabilities, and the artifacts all come together to help teams understand where they're at in this complex world of product development, gives them intentional moments to pause and consider what they're doing, why they're doing it, who they're doing it for. It identifies clear accountability so that people know exactly what they're responsible for, where they really need to focus. And then it gives us these artifacts that we can inspect and adapt along the way that help us look at our progress. And so you bring all that together, and hopefully you have successful teams and organizations generating increments of product each and every sprint.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you see sort of locate the origin with Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland around in the mid 90s, and you mentioned yourself being part of the .com boom, and the term waterfall has come up once or twice already, I think, in this conversation. And I'm just curious if it wasn't something about the fact that there was like the web and that like products could be deployed relatively quickly, that when you could get responses and stuff like that, right? Because in the old days, you sort of defined a product, you put it out there, and it was when it was out there, it was out there. It's done. And was there something about the Todd, maybe you can speak to that. Was there something about this sort of, I don't know, interactivity that was happening, the quick feedback, and the fact that you were just doing a kind of new kind of product development with web development in the 90s that led to Scrum coming about at that time?
I think that certainly plays a factor with the evolution of technology and IDEs, integrated development environments, right? Like, I mean, I remember my first IDE coding in C++, and as long as like my feedback cycle as a developer was not that great. I mean, you didn't have really even autocorrect. So, it's hitting the compile button 39,000 times a day, F5, right? Which now you have all these like advanced things that are happening in like Visual Studio, for instance. And I think the emergence of interactive websites where you could really make a business centric tools that customers could go react on, maybe help that. However, I think the first way to manage those as a project was through traditional project management. And I think this is, by the way, me hypothesizing, because when I first got into it, I was having to do all of this stuff, right? It's like when you did some web development, like with ASP or something like that, you'd be like, but I could just deploy this one thing right now. And they'd be like, no, that's in 6 months. And you're like, but why can't we just put it out right now? I don't understand, right? Like, so it was kind of like this. I think it really came from developers to some extent, just being frustrated, not being able to release their things, and then not really understanding if it was the right thing, and then being told it was the wrong thing, and you didn't listen to a document, but that document was wrong when you went and fact checked it with a stakeholder or talked with a customer about how they were managing their inventory. So I think that it's a combination of maybe those two worlds colliding, like the emergence of new technologies, like .NET came on the scene, and then you had ASP.NET and all that other things, all those things happening, and then deployments following right behind that, being able to more easily deploy and not just store things on like a server somewhere, right? Like I think it was that, and then coming to a head of the fact of the frustration of, we just spent 6 months building the wrong thing. And I just remember feelings of entire frustration that I would get blamed for building the wrong thing when the requirements document was actually incorrect, but then it was my interpretation of all this stuff. And I think that's maybe where it led to. Because I mean, make no mistake, I think that this whole thing started with developers being frustrated about how they were being asked to work and building the wrong thing, and then deploying it and feeling like they were getting the blame for building the wrong thing. Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great answer. I mean, you guys know about this way more than I do, but of course, that was about, I don't know, a few years after the mid-90s, in the early 2000s, when the Agile Manifesto was created, and both the founders of Scrum, Ken and Jeff, were a part of that too, and definitely frustration played a huge role in that development. That people who were like on this, if you're spending 6 months working at someone else's direction, and you kind of know or suspect that something's wrong, but you're in a kind of hierarchical, not just sort of organization, but like workflow, and you have no power to kind of push back up. And excuse me, that there's all these kind of feedback mechanisms that are out there that you can use at that point to sort of judge what you're doing and do it more quickly than you could in the past. So it was a sort of really interesting inflection point in the history of sort of, manufacturing and product development and stuff like that happened in that sort of, 95 to 2005.
Yeah, as technology is making this huge surge, right? Because there was a huge surge with the way the technology was going. And I mean, just every year there was like major changes to IDEs and coding languages. And, you went from stuff that was fairly static and really difficult to build into, like 3 years later, you had all this stuff that was button clicks. Like I just start to think of like even setting up a continuous integration build was such a hassle at first, and now you go into Azure and it's like click, it's done, right? So it just like that would happen very quickly over the period of like 5 years, really.
Yeah, it's the acceleration of technology was such a huge catalyst, right? I mean, we had Sun Microsystems putting a lot of money into Java at that point. The Tomcat project made deploying so much simpler than it used to be on other platforms. Ant build scripts came along at that. Like the tools just got so exponentially better over a short period of time that, a lot of people forget that Scrum really is driven by technical excellence, and the inability to test frequently, the inability to deploy easily, the inability to rapidly develop. Like if you don't have those things, Scrum is very difficult. And so I think your point is really good in that, it was at that time where those tools were accelerating, the technical practices were accelerating, extreme programming was coming up right along with Scrum, and encouraging developers to use these excellent practices alongside whatever framework they chose. And it was just one of those kind of lightning in a bottle moments where the right tech, the right tools, the right ideas, the right framework. And I think there was also just such a hunger for a less heavy process and practice. And all those things came together, and I think it made a lot of this possible. What's interesting about where we've landed, 20, 30 some years later, is that a lot of those, like the tools and the technical excellence has kind of been divorced from the framework. And I think that's why, to some extent, you'll see a lot of these so-called agile transformations fail. You'll see a lot of difficulties that teams have with adopting, Scrum or Kanban or whatever agile practice they want, is that they forgot the extreme programming part. They forgot the quality part. They forgot the tooling. They forgot the better architecture. And they thought that a framework defined in 13 pages in the Scrum guide would save them from years and years and years of mismanagement and bad decisions. And it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just one last thing I would like to go over before we go into fixing your Scrum and things like that, and what it means for a Scrum to be broken and organizations to maybe be down the wrong path. So Ryan, you talked about you've talked about some of the artifacts and events, but I don't know if we've talked about roles yet, which is kind of the third part of sort of the Scrum framework. So can you talk a little bit about what the roles are in Scrum?
Yeah, we've got Scrum Master, Product Owner, and Developers, and that Scrum Master. That's a person who is, they own the Scrum practice, they own the Scrum process, but they're also the agile coach to the organization. So they're working with leadership, management, other departments to understand agility, to understand empirical process control, right? So they're working inside and outside of the team, trying to make sure that agility can flourish in that environment. They're removing the impediments to delivery. Right. I'm actually more interested in delivery than anything else. We've got to ship things. We got to ship them frequently. We need to get things out into the world to get feedback. And that's where, the Scrum Master needs to be really, I think that's where they just have to be an expert. I struggle a lot with this idea that you can be a Scrum Master having never delivered a product. It's really just wild to me. And so I think, from a Scrum Master perspective, Scrum very well. You can work with leadership and management and other groups. You can help teams remove the things that slow them down, and you understand what it takes to deliver in a complex environment. A product owner, on the other hand, they're trying to figure out what's the most valuable thing to do right now. How do I make sure that the money we're spending to fund this Scrum team, that it is the best spent money in the organization, that the juice is worth the squeeze, right? And they're ruthless about it. They're trying to figure out what's the minimal but sufficient amount of work we can do to meet this need, to solve this problem, to move on to the next thing. And they're laser focused on that. But they also want quality. They want a great product out into the world. They're doing the stakeholder management. They're doing the work with users, and they're still doing all of the traditional product management work that great authors like Melissa Perry, Marty Kagan, and others write about, but they're also a member of a Scrum team. So their world is enhanced, not diminished. And then you have developers. So they are professionals. They are people doing high quality work to solve the problems that have been identified by the product owner. And hopefully they're doing that in creative and excellent ways, where they're building wonderful architectures. They're using great tools and technology to keep quality high, deployments frequent, and feedback turned up to 11. And so they are there to build, they're there to create. And I think those three roles or accountabilities working well together can create some of the most beloved products on the planet. When one of those are out of alignment, that Scrum Master's got to jump in and get that harmony back in place with, Because if those three roles are working well together, using the framework and listening to their feedback, their customers, wonderful things happen in companies. But when one of those pieces fall apart, then you end up buying our book and needing to read some of the chapters to figure out where we're missing things.
Yeah, and the I guess one last thing before we talk about that is that the role of the developers in this is very interesting. I think a lot of people, when we talk about waterfall and things like that, they think like the developers on the receiving end of task lists, basically.
Right.
And, the product owner is like prioritizing them and firing off kind of tasks to people to do. But that's not the case. That's not what we're talking about here. The developers, as you said, they're professionals, and they're the ones who are more or less coming up with the kind of plan and what to do.
Yeah, I think what gets missed a lot, especially in the Agile space, if you take the manifesto for Agile software development as an example, that's 17 software developers who got together and created this manifesto for the way that software could be created in a more beneficial way. Ken and Jeff, the two co-creators of Scrum, signed that manifesto. They're software developers. And so Scrum is very much a developer play. I mean, the framework empowers the developers to decide how best to solve problems, to decide how best to do their work, to decide what work will be pulled into a sprint to meet the need that a product owner's identified. And so the developers they have an equal seat at the table, right? They are not task takers or order takers. They have an equal voice into what needs to be done to achieve the greatest benefit for not only the customer, but the organization as well. And, I think that's one of the things that is so misunderstood, but also so empowering once it is understood. It's just that idea that developers have that equal placement in the framework.
Todd, can you maybe talk a little bit about an example of how Scrum can go wrong? What would it look like if I'm in an organization and maybe I'm getting the sense that things aren't working properly, but I'm not exactly sure what's wrong? What's an example of the things you would see if a sort of implementation of Scrum wasn't going correctly?
Yeah, let's kind of maybe stay on the same topic. Let's talk about what happens to developers quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
I've seen organizations that will pre-plan sprints in advance, telling developers exactly what needs to happen when, and it's waterfall in disguise. What it is it's just do this by this date, get it done, and then we're going to pretend like we're using Scrum to do it, right? So don't make no mistake, you can still be doing waterfall and calling it Scrum. We call that bad Scrum, zombie Scrum, mechanical Scrum, whatever you want to call it. But I've literally seen, well, you're on sprint 2 right now. We have sprint 11 needs to have these things done. Well, developers get in there in sprint 2, start working on it and realizing it's more complex than they thought, right? It's funny how that works, right? It's not just changing a light bulb. We're talking about complex work, stuff that takes a lot of skill, a lot of time, sometimes asking different questions. And you kind of can open Pandora's box. I mean, I've done that with a bug before. I think I should be done with this in an hour. 3 days later, you're banging your head on your desk, trying to figure out how to even replicate it, but it's urgent. So you need to fix it. So I think that case and zeroing in on the developers, and then what happens there, right? If we're just forced to do things, we start lowering quality. We start rushing our work. We start working a lot of overtime, and it's no better off than what it was before. And unfortunately, organizations are still doing that today. We're really hoping that fixing your Scrum makes a dent in that. It's been out for a little bit now, but we still feel like there's a lot of work left to be done. And we see so many times in organizations having surety around the plan, right? And then to your point earlier, that plan then being dictated to developers. And then when developers run into any problems, the resolution is, well, let's either add more developers or just have the developers work longer days. When the reality is, going back to the origins of our conversation, this is complex work. Just as I was finding out as a product owner that if you fall in love with an idea, that idea may not work out. Well, if you fall in love with a plan, that plan may not work out, right? And especially when you run into unforeseen circumstances. So kind of whittling in on that developer there, that's where we see it a lot, is this surety of plan, and it still exists today.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You get to some very deep sort of problems that you partly go into you do go into in your book. For example, you've got a section called Taylorism creeping back in, where kind of like older models of getting things done, basically just kind of, it's very hard to kind of keep them from coming in. And this is something that's come up on the podcast many times in the past. Is something like that I've never really been quite able to put my finger on, but there's something about the invisibility of the work that's done by programmers that seems to be incompatible with a lot of the ways that, like, deeply ingrained, maybe ancient ways of sort of, managing projects, right? Like if I'm, building an aqueduct, I can see the people moving around and sort of hewing the stone and building it up and things like that, right? Whereas, or like, doing a salt mine or something like that, right? I can see the hole getting deeper. I can see the people at all the levels, and what they're doing. And I can see this sort of whatever's being mined coming out in carts. But with programming, as let's say you're like sort of on the very, very business side of things, you just see a bunch of people sitting at desks, tapping away at keys, and maybe even doing like the hardest work ever, which is this.
Yeah.
What are you supposed to make of that as a manager? And there's a lot, I think there's something very deep about being in, like, I've got to have something I can see. I've got to see the progress, and
I think there's an aspect of it too, where then when you show it, it's just a button that says calculate.
Right.
What took you 2 sprints to build this button that says calculate? It's just putting out 30 numbers in an Excel spreadsheet or on this report, right? And what they don't see is the wild amount of logic in the background that is that's producing those numbers, right? And I'm thinking of a time that I worked for a company that was building industrial refrigeration equipment, and they we were supposed to send numbers to sales so that they could send them to engineers, right? And they'd be like, what took so long for that button? And you peel the layers back and you're like, oh my gosh, that's like 10,000 lines of code that at any given point, something could go really wrong. And then you have to validate it. We have automated tests written against it to ensure that when we have to add to that things don't break, right? And just a lot of pounding your head against the monitor while you're trying to get 2 numbers that don't match up. You can't figure out why they don't match up. So you need to redo some functions or move some stuff around, and then you get them to match up, but it doesn't match. It's like all this stuff, but all it looks like is a button that says calculate on a report. And so I actually had someone say that in a sprint review one time, where it's just a button and you guys just drag and drop stuff in the background. Why'd this take a whole sprint? And we were like, all right, pull up the ID, let's show you. And they're like, oh, that's a lot.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, logic is invisible. Unless you've got like a kind of Rube Goldberg machine or something like that. And it just brings it with it these inherent problems, which is maybe a good opportunity to talk about values. And Ryan, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, about the way, I mean, things can go wrong partly because people don't have the right values or do have the wrong values when they're doing Scrum. And what are some of the Scrum values?
Yeah, the Scrum values are focus, openness, commitment, courage, and respect. And they're kind of they're the behavioral patterns or the behavioral guidance that we expect professionals to follow as they use the framework. The framework, its greatest strength and its greatest weakness is that it's 13 pages. It's awesome that it gives you flexibility. It's also awful that it allows you to make decisions about how you work. It's the old .NET versus Java discussion. .NET was great because it made all of the decisions for you. Here's the IDE you're going to use. Here's the language you're going to use. Here's the plugin you're going to use. Here's how you're going to deploy. And Java had 1,000 options for everything. And it was a mess. And so with Scrum has opted for flexibility. And so there will be situations you run into that are not covered by the Scrum guide. That will happen day one. And so you have these values to fall back on. When extra work tries to get jammed into a sprint, you can leverage that value of focus to say, no, we are focused on our sprint goal because that sprint goal represents value, and that should lead us to incrementally make progress towards our product goal. Then that's what and organizationally, that's what we're after. And so, no, we're going to focus here. And commitment could be leveraged here too. We are committed to our goals. We are committed as a team to do what has been identified to be the most valuable thing. Courage would be saying no to the extra work because it could actually distract us from that sprint goal. Sometimes it's hard to say truth to power. Respect would tell us to do that in the right way to avoid upsetting those we're saying no to. And then openness, openness is a weird one, and it's often misunderstood. And I think Todd and I came to the realization while writing this book that openness would mean being open to the idea that we could be wrong about this decision that we're making, to push back on the work and to accept better data and better ideas and to be open to all of that. And so the values are there to help us in times where the framework is silent, and to help us make a good decision about how to get our product a little bit further out the door. And I think that's where it's another area, to one of your previous questions, I think it's another area where teams fall short. They don't use the values. They try to treat Scrum as the process, and they just go into this rote, zombie, bad Scrum pattern where they're just mechanically using the framework to do waterfall instead of being opportunistic. And you might, well, why would I say opportunistic? I don't think Scrum is a project management framework. We don't think that. We think that it's used to be opportunistic in the marketplace. We want to see an opportunity, execute as quick as responsibly possible to deliver on that opportunity, get into the market, beat our competitors. We're trying to win, and this framework is empowering us to do that. So it's not just chop your work up into pretty waterfalls and do it with a brand new framework and a new certification. It's go be opportunistic in the marketplace, use these values to guide you, right? And to avoid becoming this mechanical practice, this mechanical thing that just looks like waterfall with new language.
Yeah, that's a really striking way of putting it. And it reminds me of when we had Jeff Sutherland on the podcast. There was a point where he sort of made the exact same thing with the same passion too, which was like, this is about winning. It's about operating in a truly competitive space and finding a way to do it. And so when we're talking about things like values, of course, we're talking about good and bad and right and wrong. But, when we talk about openness and courage, for example, like this is like a kind of senior person and maybe working with a direct report where the senior person is willing to hear bad news.
Yep.
And their report is willing to give it to them, right? The first is openness, the second is courage. And they kind of they go in both directions, I guess. Sure. But this is about like, a sort of person in a decision-making position who isn't open to hearing bad news is going to end up being, for example, like in one of your more recent videos that you did, they're going to be surprised. They're going to find themselves surprised, and they're going to blame the other person for surprising them. But if they were sending out signals that they weren't open to bad news, that I'm not talking about the specific experience that you.
No, I think you're spot on. I think there are far too many in middle management and leadership who are just acting like children. When a child finds out that they're not getting their favorite dessert, they throw a tantrum. They respond poorly to bad news. And in the workplace, we have to be professionals. I mean, that's one of the things that I really respect about Ken Schwaber and his work is that he put professionalism at the forefront, right? And so when I've been in leadership and management positions, there's no such thing as good or bad news. There's data and there's decisions. And so you can't control. I mean, look, there are people in this world who try to control every aspect of every day, and it's just a fool's errand, right? You cannot do it. You can control how you respond to it. And so when a direct report would bring data to me, and I know Todd operated this way as well, we would simply make a decision based off of what we know now. You should be using agile practices like Scrum and others to create opportunities to make new and better decisions repeatedly. Like that's a bonus. That's a wonderful thing. If you learn something and you find out, wow, that decision we just made wasn't great, but now I can make a better one, that's a blessing, not a curse, right? That's amazing. And people should embrace that. And if you're throwing a fit every time that you might have been wrong, I mean, that's infantile. That's nonsense.
It's interesting you say that, Ryan, because I'm thinking back to the book Extreme Programming by Ken Beck. he has this idea in there around dispelling vulnerability. And he talks about this concept of adolescence surety. I don't know if you remember that in the book, but it's, I know better than anyone else.
Yeah.
And all I need to be is to be left alone to be the greatest. And he talks about how working that way is not the appropriate way to work. And you talk about that from either a developer or a senior manager's perspective. And, I think he mentioned something about like the old habit of holding something back. And I mean, that book's been around for a long time, and we're still experiencing that in office environments, right? You have senior managers putting up the wall to lend to your point, giving signals that I don't want to hear bad news, only good news.
Yeah.
And then it is discouraging developers from giving the bad news. Or sometimes you have developers that are like, well, I will fix it tomorrow. I just need one more day, and not giving the signals that they need. And then so these barriers are built, and tying all that in with all these old concepts of working, such as, the Tayloristic type mindset. It really still has a lot of powder keg type stuff going on in office places because of it. The really good companies that we work with have, we've seen developers walk into a CIO office and just be like, things are going terribly wrong on this project. We found this news out this morning, right?
And conversely, I distinctly remember Todd and I being in a room, and we've got the CEO taking a leadership course along with direct reports and developers, and a topic came up, and the CEO just stood up and said, "Stop, wait a minute. That's fixed. I was told that was fixed months ago." And the developers are like, "What are you talking about? We're still struggling with this." And the CEO turned to one of his VPs and said, "It's in your latest report that this has been fixed for months." And there's such a disconnect about what information can be given to who, and to Todd's point, the holding back of information and those barriers. And one of them got exposed, and I think we had to leave the room for a bit while they worked through what had happened. And when we came back, there were definitely some red faces and some irritation. And one of the takeaways that the CEO discussed with us was, it's just like, I had no idea how disconnected I was from what was actually happening. And this is not a small 30-person company. This is a massive medical device company in the Midwest. This is a company with thousands, not just tens of employees. And that disconnect is so real because of that fear of saying something that might upset someone else, or that fear of surprising someone, and it just creates so much ineffectiveness, inefficiency. It makes improvement near impossible. It is just such a toxic thing.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Will Seeley gave me this quote. I'm not sure if it originated from her or someone else, but the one thing that scales faster than anything else is problems.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's just happening with communication.
That's really good. That's really good. It reminds me, I've got this sort of old kind of only half tongue-in-cheek joke about how, getting a government contract is a skill unto itself that has nothing to do with fulfilling whatever the contract is to do.
Oh, yeah.
And the same thing goes for rising in a hierarchical organization. There might be people who are very good at that, and it's completely orthogonal. That skill is completely orthogonal to whatever the organization is actually notionally there to be doing. And you can see this in sort of, zombie organizations where they get basically taken over by people who are just playing the hierarchy game. And there's a certain bookstore company that I could name that was long subject to that before it found its way out. The last thing I wanted to talk about, actually, speaking of things that you can't control and sometimes getting bad news, the last thing we'd like to talk about on the podcast is the book creation product, process itself, authoring and things like that. So your book has a very interesting origin story of its own. Can you tell the audience, just for the last couple of minutes that we've got, when was the book released first?
In 2020, in January of 2020. So I know, and it's strange because it's like yesterday, Ryan and I went to a book launch event. We were invited by one of our friends to do a big talk at Agile NYC, right, Ryan? Yeah. And Ryan and I were on a train back from New York City. He was actually coming back to our town near my hometown to do another book launch thing. And we were like talking about, just like, do you hear about this virus thing going around?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, yeah, it's just not in the news that much yet. And who would have known the whole world changed 2 months later? So Ryan, I still think, has a bunch of hard copies because we don't
Oh,
do
yeah.
conferences as much anymore.
Yeah, we had so many conferences lined up, and we were supposed to be giving out tons of copies, and now they're still slowly but surely we're getting rid of them. But yeah, it was an interesting time to release a book.
Yeah, definitely. And you eventually, the reason the book is sort of being re-released is you got the rights back yourselves from your publisher.
Correct.
So that now you're now in control of it, and you can now go and promote it however you like.
And the publisher was excellent, right? So we had a great relationship with them. Our editor made us sound so much better than what we deserved. Like, it was certainly as an amicable thing. I think they are focusing more on tech, and this is more process and practice. And so it was a very, Dave Thomas, Andy Hunt, the Pragmatic team, they're excellent. And we had a wonderful experience with them. And so this was just, they opted not to do a second edition. We would like to do a second edition someday, or maybe do workshops, or maybe do videos. And so they graciously released the rights back to us. And we felt that Leanpub would be a wonderful home for the book. Just, we love your platform. We love the way that you've handled other books in the Agile space. And so we thought, our first thought was, let's do this through Leanpub. And it's just been a great experience with you guys as well from day one.
Oh, well, thanks very much for the kind words and for sharing that story. The last question I always have on the podcast, if the guests are using Leanpub as a platform, is if there was one thing that when you're using Leanpub has you shaking your fist going, damn you, Leanpub, this is so frustrating and broken, that we could fix for you, or if there was one magical feature we could build for you, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
Yes. Yeah. So to be honest with you, I think the spec is really easy. I mean, it's markdown, right? It's or markdown-esque with some things about it. What I really wish is that, and maybe this is possible and I don't know, what I really wish is that you could locally build the PDF somehow. Only because going up and having to generate it manually and bringing it back down when you're just trying to figure out where an image goes or whether you got a chapter, because I did a lot of conversion, right? Like just ripping out the spec that we had before and converting it into the book. So I'd just be like, okay, I fixed that one paragraph. Now I have these other ones to fix. So it's just that generation process. Or like maybe even just like you can toggle a switch and have it do like an automatic build, right? So that when I'm doing things and I'm checking things in and I'm finding problems, I can just go up and download it. That for me would be.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I mean, one version of that question we've had it before from sort of frustrated people. So for anyone listening, when you write a Leanpub book on our platform, you write it in plain text, and then you click a button to generate the ebook files. And that takes some time, and you have to use us. You can't just do it on your computer. And so yeah, we've had people ask us for that to run it locally, to build it on their own computer, or to have it just having it basically in real time, like side by side. In my text on the left and the thing on the right. The latter we might do someday. I probably will. The former probably not. But we do the two ways to mitigate that problem are one is we do have an API that you can set up so that you can kind of like do things and it'll automatically generate previews for you, so you don't have to go click buttons in the browser basically to do everything. And the other thing is if you go to the preview page where you generate the previews, there's a subset option. So you can actually make a subset.txt file. I'm actually not 100% sure that would work in the browser, which I should know. But this was back in the days of if you're using GitHub or Dropbox, you can have a subset.txt file and you can use that to just generate a tiny part.
Oh, cool. Yeah, because we have it up in GitHub and pulling from GitHub.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can probably use the subset.txt feature to make things go faster. Well, Ryan and Todd, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to do this interview with me and to talk to our audience. The book is Fixing Your Scrum, Practical Solutions to Common Scrum Problems.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks.